Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. I'm getting ready to start another pair of my Waffle cookie socks. These socks are worked from the toe up, and they use both Japanese short row toes and heels. And there's two ways that you can do Japanese short rows. One is the pinned method, where you use lots and lots of locking stitch markers to help you along the way. The second is the unpinned or catch method, where you don't use any of those locking stitch markers. There are really two paths to the same destination, and I'm going to be creating tutorials for both methods. And I'll divide those tutorials into the same sections so you can watch them side by side to compare the process if you like. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the pinned method of doing Japanese short rows. When you're casting on for a toe-up short row toe, you cast on your stitches using either a provisional or a double-sided cast on. Instead of the cast on happening here at the tip of the toe, the cast on is either placed at the base of the toe across the top of the sock or at the base of the toe across the bottom of the sock. And I prefer if my cast on stitches happen at the bottom of the sock. After I switch directions from working the toe one way and start working the foot in the opposite direction, inevitably there is going to be a very slight tension irregularity across the cast on. If the cast on has happened across the bottom of the foot, nobody is going to see that except for me. If you're using a pattern, it will tell you how many turning stitches should be on each side of your toe as you work the first half of the shaping. In my case, I'm going to have 11 turning stitches on each side. If you're not following a pattern, a good rule of thumb is that a third of your toe stitches at the center of the toe will be regular stitches, and a third on each side will be turning stitches. For the pinned method, before we start knitting, we want to place locking stitch markers onto our yarn, and you place as many markers as there are turning stitches. So I've clipped on 22 locking stitch markers. And it can be helpful if you alternate colors. So I have 11 pink markers and 11 blue markers. I'll begin my toe by knitting across the first right side row until I get to one stitch before the end of the toe stitches. And I'll just slide those markers down and out of the way as I'm knitting across that first row. When I get to the end of my first right side short row, I'm going to turn my work over. I'm going to slip one stitch purlwise from the left to the right, and then I'm going to slide one stitch marker down to my fabric. And then I will purl across my first wrong side row until I get to one stitch before the end of the toe. When I get to the end of my first short wrong side row, again, I'm going to carefully turn my work over. I'm going to slip one stitch purlwise from the left to the right, and I'm going to slide one more marker down my yarn until it's pressed up tight against my fabric. And then I'm ready to continue knitting my next right side row. And you'll notice here that there is a little gap in between my final toe stitch and the first stitch of the previous row. I want to knit to one stitch before before that gap, and there happens to be a marker right there. So I'm just going to knit my next right side row until I get to that marker. For all the remaining right side turns, you'll knit across to the marker, which is going to happen 1 stitch before a gap. Turn your work over, slip 1 stitch purlwise, and then slide a marker down your yarn until it's pressed up against your fabric. Then on the wrong side, again, you're going to purl across until you get to the next marker, which is going to be 1 stitch before the next gap. For all of the remaining wrong side turns, on the wrong side you'll purl to the marker, which happens to be 1 stitch before your next gap. Turn your work over, slip a stitch purlwise, and slide 1 marker down to your fabric. And you continue turning by alternating right side and wrong side rows until all of your markers are moved down to your fabric, and you want to make sure that you end after a wrong side turn, slip, and slide. I've almost finished the first half of my toe shaping, which is going to be on the bottom of my foot. And things look a little bit crazy because I have all these locking stitch markers on my fabric, but it's going to be perfectly fine. I've worked my final wrong side row, so I'm going to do my final turn, slip a stitch, and slide the marker down to my fabric. Now I'm ready to work the second half of the toe, which is going to be on the top of my foot. Each row is going to be 1 stitch longer than the last, and I'm going to be closing up all of these gaps on the sides of the toe. To begin, I'm going to knit across my first right side row to 1 stitch after this first marker, and that happens to be the first, I'll be knitting to the first gap on the side of the toe. As I close up my first right side gap, I'm going to think of the columns of stitches on my right needle as generations of stitches. So the child stitch is up on my needle, the stitch in the row before that is the parent, and then the grandparent, and so on. I want to close this first gap by working the horizontal bar that's on the wrong side of the fabric, that when I pull it, it tightens up this parent stitch, and I want to work that horizontal bar together with the next stitch on my left needle. Lucky for us, these pins are attached to the horizontal bar that needs to be lifted. So when I pull on this locking stitch marker, watch the parent stitch here below and see how it tightens up and gets smaller. That's how I know I have the right stitch. So I'm going to open things up again so that my tension isn't messed up. I'm going to lift this pinned bar up and onto my left needle. And you'll notice here that this stitch has a conventional stitch mount. So the right hand leg of the stitch is at the front of the needle. The left hand leg of the stitch is over here at the back of the needle. I can remove my locking stitch marker, and then I'm going to knit that lifted stitch, that lifted bar, and the next stitch together. as I'm knitting these two stitches together, notice my right hand needle goes through the stitch and then the lifted bar. That order is important to make sure that the gap is closed. So I'll knit those two stitches together, turn my work over, and then I can purl across the next wrong side row until I get to the gap, or one stitch after this next marker. To close my first wrong side gap, again, I want to work the horizontal bar that tightens up that parent stitch together with the next stitch on my left needle. And remember before I said when you're working them together, the right needle is going to go through the stitch first and then the lift to make sure that everything is nice and tight and closed. This time on the wrong side to do that, it's easiest if we slip this purl or this stitch purlwise first before we lift the bar, because then our stitches will be in the right order when we purl things together. So watch that parent stitch below here, how when I pull the pin, it tightens up that parent stitch. So we know we have our pin on the right horizontal bar. So again, I'm just going to lift that pin up onto my left needle. Again, we have a conventional stitch mount. The right hand leg is at the front. The left hand leg of that lifted bar is at the back. I can remove my locking stitch marker. Return that slipped stitch back to the left needle so I can purl the stitch and the bar together, and then do just that. Purl the stitch and that lifted bar together, and then turn my work over. So now for the remaining right side rows, I will knit across until I get to the gap, which happens to be one stitch after the next marker. Notice that this time when we reach the gap, it's taller than the first time we met the gaps on each side. And that's because we've added 2 extra rows, one to close the gap on the first right side, one to close the gap on the first wrong side. So this gap here is 2 rows taller. That just means that as we're closing this gap, instead of choosing the horizontal bar that tightens the parent stitch, we're going to choose the horizontal bar that tightens the great grandparent stitch and work that together with the next stitch on our left needle. Again, since we have used this pinned method of doing Japanese short rows, our pin is already attached on that horizontal bar. So watch the child, parent, grandparent, great grandparent stitch right here. As I pull on that pin, that's the stitch that gets tightened up. So our pin is definitely in the right place. All we need to do is grasp the pin, lift that bar up onto our left hand needle. Just make sure our stitch mount is conventional with the right hand side of the lifted stitch at the front, the left hand side at the back. Remove the pin and knit the stitch that we lifted together with the next stitch on our needle. Turn your work over and purl across to the next gap. To close all of our remaining wrong side gaps, again, we want to work the horizontal bar that tightens up the great grandparent stitch together with the next stitch. So lucky again for us, our pins are on that correct bar. So watch the child, parent, grandparent, great grandparent. When I pull on the pin, the great grandparent tightens up. So our pin is in the right place. When we're working those two stitches together, we need to reverse the order. So to do that, you slip a stitch, grab the pin, and lift that horizontal bar up onto the left needle. And again, just make sure it has a conventional stitch mount, so the right side of that lifted strand is at the front of the needle, the left side is at the back. You can remove the pin, return the slipped stitch to your left needle, and then purl the stitch and the lifted strand together. And then turn things over to the other side. And you'll continue working your short rows, working to a gap, closing the gap, and then working to the next gap on the wrong side and closing that gap. Each row will get one stitch longer than the last, and keep doing that until all of your pins have been removed and all of your gaps have been closed. I'm almost done with the toe of my sock. I only have one marker left. I've purled across my final wrong side row. So now I just need to close up this final gap by slipping my stitch, grabbing the marker, lifting that horizontal bar onto my left needle, remove the marker, return the slipped stitch over to my left needle, and then purl the stitch and the lifted strand together. And then my toe is complete. I can turn my work over. I'm going to zoom back out again. Whoops. The stitches that I've been working across for the toe are at the top of my foot. The stitches on the other side were the opposite side of my cast on over here. And depending on what kind of double-sided cast on I use, they're either on a needle or the needle cord, or perhaps a piece of waste yarn. At this point, my toe is all done, and I can continue my sock by working in the rounds, now that my short rows are done, and knit the foot of my sock. I hope you enjoyed learning how to knit a toe-up pinned Japanese short row sock toe. If you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you'd like to try this technique in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechillydog.com and look for my waffle cookie socks. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!